From the gridiron to the hardwood, James Mesh breaks it all down. It's time for another episode of Cleats and Sneaks.
The conference finals are set, and we now know who is going to play for the right to go to the NBA Finals as well as become an NBA champion. Quite a few new faces. We're not used to these guys being here. Welcome into another edition of Cleats and Sneaks. I'm your host, James Mesh. And man, let me tell you, when it comes to the NBA playoffs, it has been nothing short of amazing. It is kind of interesting, though, because when it comes to the NBA playoffs, you're kind of used to the same guys and same teams make it year in and year out. But based off of what we've seen and based off of who is now in the Eastern and Western Conference Finals, we got quite a few new faces. Now, of course, the Boston Celtics, we fully anticipated them to get to this point, and they've done so relatively easily. They've had some solid matchups that they've been able to take advantage of and win each of their first two series in 5 games. Of course, it started with the Miami Heat. Of course, they did not have Jimmy Butler in that series, but they also took on the Cleveland Cavaliers. And I had talked about it before where it felt like this matchup maybe was not as easy or as free of a win than a lot of people anticipated, but because of a couple key injuries to Cleveland, it ended up being another gentleman's sweep in favor of the Celtics. But you look at other teams like the Indiana Pacers, who were the 6th seed in this year's playoffs. I don't think many people anticipated them to get to this point. Then you look at the Dallas Mavericks, who were the 5 seed after they took down the Oklahoma City Thunder. Then the Minnesota Timberwolves, who, of course, were the 1 seed for a majority of the season in the Western Conference, but because of an injury to Karl Anthony Towns, they ended up dropping to the 3 seed. But nevertheless, we've got quite a few great matchups. Now, how did we get here? Of course, with the Boston Celtics taking on the Cleveland Cavaliers, I had mentioned it, they didn't have Jarrett Allen, their starting center, so that was a big loss there because he's really good on the defensive end of the floor, but the Boston Celtics did not have Kristaps Porzingis for the entirety of the series either. Now, with the Cavs, once it got to games 4 and 5, they didn't have their big playmakers. They didn't have Donovan Mitchell to step up. He had been phenomenal for the first 3 games of the series, but because of an injury, he wasn't able to play in games 4 or 5. And then in game 5, Karis LeVert was also unavailable, and he had been kind of streaky. Sometimes he's really on and he's able to put up 40 for you, but then there are also times where he's kind of pedestrian and maybe he scores 10 points and he doesn't have an efficient shooting night and he's not able to play very good defense. But the Celtics were able to come on top and win in 5 games, a gentleman's sweep, including in games 4 and 5. It was a little bit closer than maybe a lot of people anticipated. The Celtics were able to win game 4 109-102, only winning by 7. That one was a very close one despite the injuries. But once you got to game 5, it was kind of close here and there. However, Celtics were able to prevail 113-98, winning that game by 15. Now, of course, when you look at the Pacers and Knicks, this one was a very interesting series because if you look at the Pacers, they're very good at home, but they're not very good on the road. And it very much showed in the first 4 games, or at least the first 5 games, actually. You look at how the Knicks were able to still win games 1 and 2, despite not using much of their bench, relying on guys like Josh Hart and Jalen Brunson and Dante DiVincenzo to carry the workload, and Isaiah Hartenstein, even though he's not necessarily a starting center, he's still out there giving you really good minutes, and he was very productive throughout the playoffs. But they were able to win the first 2 games. The Pacers come back. They go to their home floor. They end up getting those 2 pretty handily. But once you got to game 5, it was actually very shocking how dominant the Knicks were at home because it felt like in games 1 and 2, the Pacers had opportunities to come back and actually steal a win on the road. They weren't able to get it done. Game 5 was an utter dominant one as the Pacers ended up winning that one 121-91, winning that one by 30. Now, a big thing that I had noticed in that game was the fact that you look at the starting 5 for the Knicks at that point, Isaiah Hartenstein, he's 7 foot. Of course, he's going to be their center. But you look at the other 4 guys in the starting lineup, 80% of their lineup is under 6'5". Miles McBride, he's 6'1". Jalen Brunson is listed at 6'2". And then Dante DiVincenzo and Josh Hart are both listed at 6'4". But the thing that really stood out for me in Game 5 between the Knicks and the Pacers was the fact that the Knicks were able to dominate the boards, even though they felt like, or at least I felt like, they were heavily undersized compared to what the Pacers have with guys like Pascal Siakam, Miles Turner, even Tyrese Halliburton is a really tall guard himself. But when it came down to it, the Pacers got out-rebounded exponentially, and that helped give second chance points to the Knicks. That's how they were able to really win Game 5. Now, once you got to Game 6, Indiana was able to win that one at home. So it came down to Game 7. However, OG Anunoby wasn't there for the majority of the series. Jalen Brunson, he was beat up. It was kind of a question whether he was going to be able to stay in for as long as he did, but they also didn't have Julius Randle and they didn't have Mitchell Robinson. So quite a few injuries. Plus, they don't go to their bench a lot because of Tom Thibodeau. He likes to put in a lot of minutes to his first 5 or 6 guys and doesn't really go beyond that for the most part. But it came down to Game 7. OG Anunoby, he was able to come back. Josh Hart, he was also injured, but they ended up having him play. And then Jalen Brunson, despite the injury to his lower body, he was still able to play as well. And because of that, the fact that it was at home, the Pacers aren't a good road team. All signs to me pointed towards them being able to get it done at home in it'd be a 1 and 2 seed in the Eastern Conference Finals between the Boston Celtics and New York Knicks. Well, the Pacers had a different way of thinking. They end up shooting 67% from the floor for the entirety of the game, and they end up getting the 130-109 win to win in Game 7 in the Madison Square Garden. I was never anticipating this because of there being such a difference between the Pacers at home and on the road. Yet they were able to get it done. A big reason why they were able to get it done was because the Knicks, Jalen Brunson, he had basically been their hero and been the main reason why they were able to win so many games and get as far as they did, because he was basically averaging 40 points in the playoffs, and he fractured his hand early on in the game, and it just was signed, sealed, and delivered, put them away. Pacers win that one pretty easily, and that's despite them not having a very good defense. And even though Brunson wasn't there for a majority of the game, the Pacers still shot relatively well, 43% as a team, 37-38% from three-point range. So they still did relatively well, and they're still able to put up 109, which is respectable. It was just the fact that the Pacers couldn't miss any shots, and they were able to move on to the Eastern Conference Finals. So now it's going to be an interesting matchup between the Celtics and the Pacers. Now, of course, when you look at that series between the two, it was, of course, dominated by the Celtics, including one of those games being a 50-point difference, one of the 3 50-point wins the Celtics had on the season. I think when it's all said and done, you're going to see the Celtics win this one and head off to the finals. But it kind of depends. Do you see them sweeping? Do you see them having another gentleman's sweep, 3 in a row? Do you actually see the Pacers winning 2 games and taking it to a Game 6? I think the majority of people, whether you look at fans or the media, they're picking the Celtics to move on to the finals. And I, of course, am going to do the same. However, I think the Celtics are going to be able to get it done in 5, because as you've seen them, they aren't as good at home, and it kind of throws you off. But they've been a really good road team, but it also, you look at how good the Pacers have been good at home, it makes for an interesting matchup. However, the fact that the Pacers are not very good at defense, the fact that Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown, the average for the season, they have been able to combine for 60 points between the two of them, as well as had really good shooting percentages, not only inside the three-point line, but outside three-point range. It leads me to believe that they're going to be able to get this done in 5, despite a hiccup performance by the Celtics. Even if they have a second one, I still think, despite that, they will be able to get it done. I just believe in this team, the fact that they have so many good players, and by the time we get to games 3, 4, or 5, Kristaps Porzingis should finally be back after his injury being suffered in the first round against the Miami Heat. Now, when it comes to the Western Conference, we did have those other 2 series between the Oklahoma City Thunder and Dallas Mavericks, and Minnesota Timberwolves and Denver Nuggets. And I'm going to start with that Nuggets-Wolves series, because this one was an interesting one. The fact that the Wolves were able to get 2 games on the road as they headed to their home floor, I think that was absolutely monumental, and you could just tell the way the Nuggets had played, not only in this series early on, but also in that series against the 7-seeded Lakers. They really struggled, and it came down to a couple of buzzer beater game winners by Jamal Murray for them to just get the series in 5 games. They kind of really struggled against the Lakers team that they were really supposed to dominate. So you could tell that there were chinks in that armor, and it continued to show against a really good Wolves team as they were able to dominate games 1 and 2, especially game 2, the way they had played that defense. Now, the Nuggets had extra time because of what was going on with the playoffs. They got a couple of extra days to rest before they actually played in Minnesota. They were able to get those 2 on the road to even the series. And then once they got back home for game 5, they got that one as well. But it came down to game 6 and 7. In game 6, those were one of those anomalies. And you thought the fact that the Nuggets were able to win 3 games in a row, they had all the momentum. They put the Wolves' backs against the wall, and they just needed to win more and more games. But the fact that game 6 was won by the Wolves by 45 points, that was kind of one of those throwaway games where you're saying, okay, now that it's 3-3, where game 7s are always kind of hard to predict because anything could happen at this point. Well, the Nuggets were able to go up by 15 at halftime and as much as 20 early on in the third quarter. However, once you got to that point, the Nuggets started to kind of fall apart. And by the end of the third quarter, the Timberwolves had gone on a 28-9 run, including a step-back 3 from the left wing by Anthony Edwards to cut it to within 1 headed into the fourth quarter. Now, Anthony Edwards, he did not have the greatest first half or the greatest first 2.5 quarters as he was shooting very poorly. He had to make a couple of transition dunks to kind of get going, and then he was finally able to get it going with that sidestep 3 that I had just mentioned. But as you got into the fourth quarter, he started getting into a rhythm. Jamal Murray had a really strong start, but then it came down to Jokic for the most part in the third quarter and late into the second quarter and even into the fourth quarter. It was basically the Jamal Murray and Nikola Jokic show that we're kind of used to. But because of that, you didn't see a lot of production from Michael Porter Jr. You didn't see efficient shooting from Aaron Gordon. You didn't see Michael Braun, even though Michael Braun, he was able to make some hustle plays and play really good defense at times on Anthony Edwards. The Timberwolves, as it got later into the ball game, they just really started to heat up. And once you see Rudy Gobert, of all people, hit a turnaround fadeaway on you, on Nikola Jokic, that's just kind of one of those signs that it was just not your series and it just wasn't your night, as the Wolves end up winning that one 98-90 to move on to the Western Conference Finals. Now, looking at the Thunder versus the Mavericks. The Mavericks, this one was a tough series because they give up game 1 to the Thunder, but then they win games 2 and 3. But they lose one on the home floor in game 4, 100-96. And that was a game where you saw Luka just kind of not be himself, and he was so focused on trying to get calls and have the refs give him a bunch of free throws because he's not 100%. But once you got to games 5 and 6, you could tell there was a locked-in Luka, and Kyrie wasn't the most productive as maybe you would anticipate him to be, but you saw a lot of production from other guys like Derek Lively and PJ Washington, and they were able to win games 5 and 6, 104-92, and then a close one, 117-116, to secure the series in 6 games. Of course, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, I know it was a talking point of that foul late in that ball game that basically secured the win for the Mavericks, but he ended up pinning his forearm. He hit his wrist while he was going up, and that's just something that you can't do. Now, once it gets down to the series, I think for the Mavericks and the Timberwolves, I like the fact that Luka and Kyrie has finally taken a step back and isn't trying to be the alpha number 1 option on a team. He's taken a step back and he's become a number 2, and he's mentioned, this is Luka's team. I'm going to step up when I need to, but I'm going to step back, let Luka do his thing, and it's kind of worked out. You've seen the chemistry really work, and when we'd first seen the move happen, we were questioning it, much like how we said with Rudy Gobert and the Timberwolves. But both of those teams have been able to get away from that, and they've been able to work out the chinks, work out everything out. Everything is smooth. The chemistry is all the way up. But at this point, now that it comes down to the Timberwolves and the Mavs, even though the Mavs look really good, I just look at this series and the fact that Anthony Edwards has taken such a step forward. Cat has really taken his role, much as like Kyrie has, as the number 2 option as he's gotten older. And then you're still getting really good contributions from guys like Jaden McDaniels. The fact that Rudy Gobert, even though he didn't play very well against Nikola Jokic in the series, he's still really good at the 5. If you can get solid production from those guys, I got to believe that the Timberwolves are going to win the series and punch their ticket to the NBA Finals in 6 games. I think that it's going to be tough early on. I think the teams are kind of going to take shots at each other. It's going to be even early on, but once you get into games 5 and 6, I think the Timberwolves are going to be able to outlast them and win the last 2 games to make it 4-2 in favor of Minnesota. So by that point, I think it's going to be Celtics versus Timberwolves in the latest 2024 NBA Finals. Now, when it comes to a prediction for that point, if we actually get that prediction correct, I'll come with something else. But until then, I appreciate you listening in to another edition of Cleats and Sneaks. We'll get more into the NFL once we get done with the NBA season. I'm kind of curious. It is kind of a lull right now as we're kind of going through mini camp and training camp. We still got to see what happens there. But if there's any major signings that goes on, I'll be able to mention it on this podcast. But until then, appreciate you listening in. I'll talk to you next time.